Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and these are your Sun and Rising sign horoscopes for the month of June 2020. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the air signs, Libra, Aquarius, and Gemini. There's a lot to be excited about this month because it is eclipse season again. Every time eclipse season comes around, things get a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more intense, depending on where that lands in your chart. Especially according to your rising sign, that's how and where you're going to feel it. So we'll be taking a look at that for sure. Two eclipses this month, one in Sagittarius and one in Cancer. That sort of highlights of the month. So at the beginning of the month, we're going to start with Libra rising or Libra sun if you follow your sun sign horoscopes. So the early transit of the month is Venus's cazimi with the sun, which takes place in your 9th house right around June 3rd. Now, this marks a important turning point in the overall Venus retrograde cycle, which has been in your 9th house since April, getting going with the retrograde in May, finishing up not until August in your 9th house. That brings together the topics of love, beauty, romance, and the higher mind, beliefs, learning, religion, maybe even foreign countries or foreign travel. And so you've been going through a process around these topics. The cazimi marks a moment of great empowerment for Venus as she's being reborn into her morning star phase. And so this is a moment of great clarity or insight or breakthrough, especially with the overlay of art, beauty, romance, love, relationships, and the higher mind or your religious or spiritual, even political beliefs. So it's a nice moment there. Now, when we go forward from there to the 5th of the month, immediately we get the lunar eclipse in the sign of Sagittarius, which is taking place in your opposite 3rd house. And this eclipse is also making a square with Mars in your 6th house in Pisces. Actually, I need to put Neptune and the outer planets in here. The other thing that's happening this month is that Mars is making a conjunction with Neptune, which takes place between the 12th and the 13th, and this eclipse is participating in that as well. These cadent houses, 3, 9, and 6, in general, were called metacosmios, and you've probably heard me say this before. They refer to worlds in between worlds. Often with the 3rd and the 9th house, you're talking about the spiritual, philosophical, conceptual, and intellectual worlds, the worlds of learning and thought. With the 6th house, you're talking about a place where you're working or grinding or dealing with difficulties or setbacks that are somehow interrupting life, the flow of life, or joy or happiness. It doesn't mean that something good can't come of it, but it usually indicates some degree of turmoil, a space of turmoil or difficulty or very hard work that's coming up somehow. So we see that T-square from Mars and Neptune in the 6th house, which in the 6th house may call to you to sacrifice something or really put all of yourself into something that you're fighting for or working for. And then the 3rd house eclipse reemphasizes that this is a moment of great mental and intellectual change. And so there is a shift taking place. Let's call it a kind of karmic crossroads that has to do with your intellectual, spiritual, philosophical beliefs and values, or maybe school and education, possibly even the topics of travel or foreign countries and things like that. And part of the question here is how to retain a sense of who you are, what matters to you, and what you can or cannot sacrifice on behalf of something or someone else. Especially, for example, when it comes to work right now, if you're being asked to go above and beyond what you feel comfortable with, this month you may find that there's need to speak out. Or if you feel that you're getting clear maybe on something that you really believe in and you're feeling like it's time to really double down and put more of yourself into something, these would be the kinds of themes that I would watch for. Now, when we go forward from here, later in the month, between the 18th and the 19th, we're going to see Mercury in Cancer stationing, turning retrograde. And then by the 21st, there's a solar eclipse. Now that's all happening in your 10th house, which is the place of career. So all of these mental and intellectual shifts that you're going through are leading to a very new moment for you professionally. There's some kind of culmination or accumulation of events and experiences that are happening more inwardly or perhaps more mentally or intellectually or spiritually, but they're leading to this culmination eclipse in Cancer. It's basically the last eclipse in Cancer that we're getting after a good year and a half worth of eclipses in your career house. Mercury retrograde also signifies change in your professional life or in what you're doing in the world. And it may have some tie back to your family because the Cancerian emphasis will often tie back to family of origin, parents, mother, and ask you to be sure that you're really on board with what you're doing with your life emotionally right now, and if it's helping you nurture your inner life or your family life or your private life as well. So those are things to watch for between the 18th and the 21st, but those eclipses will play out for the rest of the summer. Then on June 27th, right around the same time, Venus is finally turning direct in your 9th house and solidifying something that you've been really mulling over. Again, pointing to that house of the higher mind and beliefs, Venus turning direct, something is coming to conclusion with regard to the topics of higher education or the law or spirituality and religion, something like that. You're solidifying, something is crystallizing, and you're feeling ready to implement a new way of being in relationships and with regard to your own beliefs and ideals. Then what happens is on the 27th, right at about the very end of the month, Mars enters Aries, which is your 7th house of relationships, immediately suggesting that what you're going through this month is going to culminate with the need to take action socially or within your relationships, maybe adding the theme of conflict, confrontation, hostility, or working through things that involve certain amount of power struggle in relationships. Now, this element of power struggle in relationships, Mars, God of War, in the house of relationships, could pertain to romantic relationships or business relationships. And it's going to be there for the rest of the year because Mars is going to do a big retrograde in your 7th house later in the summer. It doesn't leave Aries until the very end of 2020. So it's a long, drawn out theme of power, conflict, and also collaborative efforts, maybe with others that require a lot of action and strength, but also definitely exploring the shadow side of your relationships through important and meaningful conflicts, let's hope. So not all, we're so conflict averse, but especially Librans sometimes can be a little too conflict averse, and Mars will test you on this between the end of June and the end of 2020. So finally, on the 30th, we can see that Jupiter is also conjoining with Pluto once again in your 4th house, which means there's another moment of tremendous catharsis relative to your home, your family, your living environment. The catharsis is sometimes difficult, deep, heavy, and intense with Pluto and Jupiter in that house, but it is transformative ultimately. So you're going to watch for that coming through the end of the month, and that will tone July as well. So that's what we've got for Librans. Let's back it up and do it again for Aquarians. Starting again towards the very beginning of the month with the Venus cazimi. Now we're going to put Aquarius on the ascendant. I recommend doing these for your rising signs because it matches with your birth chart, whereas the sun sign is just a little bit more, it's a different oracular approach that's not rooted in the actual look of your chart. It's purely rooted in your sun sign. So I find ascending signs to be better. But anyway, Aquarius rising this month, you got the Venus cazimi right around June 3rd, and that's taking place in your 5th house, which is a place of creativity. You've been going through maybe something of a creative renaissance since April. It's going to continue on until August. New ideas might be crystallizing. Creative collaborations might be appearing. Also, your relationship with pleasure, generally speaking. As a child of Saturn and with Saturn in your 1st house, sometimes there's a more serious, responsible, hardworking, disciplined, sober kind of mood. But Venus in the 5th might be really calling you to look at what brings joy and pleasure as well. It can also be bringing up the topics of children and some kind of transformative process that's been happening relative to the topics of pregnancy or children. Anyway, Venus's cazimi represents a moment of great empowerment within the Venus cycle. So you could watch for a stroke of good fortune around this time or inspiration that may also bring joy, happiness, creativity, and notice that this will then start to be implemented through the end of the month when Venus turns direct, which is taking place right around June 26th. So that's the Venus kind of power up moment at the early part of the month. Then on the 5th, we have a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. The lunar eclipse in Sagittarius is also square to Mars in Pisces, and Mars in Pisces is going into a conjunction with Neptune right around the June 12th into the 13th. So as that's happening, so in other words, you have a lunar eclipse in your 11th house in a square with Mars in Pisces in your second, and then Mars in Pisces goes right into a conjunction with Neptune between the 12th and the 13th. So about a week there where these two dynamics are really playing out. The lunar eclipse in your 11th house is the first of many that you're going to have in a house that has a lot to do with friends, social groups, colleagues, and benefactors, people who somehow share the same ideals or maybe help you to, get where you're trying to go, usually professionally. So there's changes happening socially. There's big changes happening within organizations that you belong to or groups or who you see as your people and who you need or want around you, who you're choosing to associate with. There's some deep changes going on there, possibly changes that are very personal involving specific friendships as well. The lunar eclipse happening in a square with Mars and Neptune in the second house are also calling into question the topic of your resources, your money, your finances, where you want to put your time, energy, and resources, for what greater cause you're working or acting or pouring yourself into, and whether you're giving too much or maybe you're, sometimes Mars Neptune is like Joan of Arc. It's very visionary. It has this kind of call to arms, call to action, maybe something spiritual or transcendent or humanitarian. But we can also tilt at windmills like Don Quixote and be led on by delusional ideas about what we are giving ourselves to or what we think we're going to get back in relation to what we're giving. So you want to be careful about those themes. But it could also suggest some kind of very interesting collaboration that's shifting for you right now in alignment with these social changes indicated by the lunar eclipse in your 11th house. Now, later in the month, between the 18th and the 21st, we're going to see Mercury in Cancer turning retrograde. Let me make sure I get this. There we go. And that retrograde Mercury in Cancer in your 6th house is followed by a solar eclipse in Cancer in your 6th house. Now, the 6th house is a place that it's a kind of liminal space that is often it's like I sometimes compare the 6th house to moving. If you've ever had to move, there's this weird period of chaos between deconstructing your place, packing it up, cleaning it up, getting it out, transitioning into the other space, getting unpacked, and it's a lot of work. People say that moving is one of the most traumatic things that people can experience, especially people who have to do it regularly. The 6th house feels like that kind of space. It's a space that was traditionally associated with strife, misfortune, hard work, and usually not being able to rest because there's some chronic state of having to kind of trudge through something. Now, that doesn't sound great, but it could suggest that there is some kind of difficult soul work or labor that you're doing right now, especially emotionally or in relation to home, family, parents, mother, all Cancerian things. The Mercury retrograde implies the same kind of work or revision that could be happening right now. A revision meaning some kind of inward focus or some in some ways having to go back and rework something from the emotional past, could have some kind of family or karmic roots in family. And it could also be related to the health of family members or to your own health. With Saturn in your 1st house, you definitely want to be a little bit careful right now, especially since it's retrograde, about to dip back into your 12th house. You've gotten a little preview of what Saturn in your 1st house is like. It's certainly, I think, better than Saturn in the 12th, but you are about to swing back into a period where Saturn's going to have a little bit more work in your 12th house to do before the end of the year. So the 6th house kind of emphasizes that, the 6th house eclipse does, by saying, look, there's a little bit more work to do here on something, and it may be emotionally taxing, but there's some necessity for it. And it's very important to be emotionally discerning right now, because with Mars and Neptune conjoining, there's also, potentially there's the feeling of being on some kind of crusade. And you want to be careful that you don't emotionally exhaust yourself with something like that as well. So then on June 27th, a little bit later in the month, you're going to get Mars. Mars is moving into your 3rd house in the sign of Aries, where it will now stay until the end of the year with a big long retrograde to come later in the summer. Now, that is the house that is associated with the mind, with communication, technology, media, and everything pertaining to your local or immediate environment and all the changes and fluctuations that tend to happen in that space. So again, a little bit of a degree of chaos with Mars in that space. You could be dealing with an increased level of volatility or change and transformation that you're kind of having to work or sludge through. Remember that the sixth house, which I just talked about, that has that same kind of feeling, was called the joy of Mars, who's the planet of strife and work. All work is spiritual work if we have the right attitude. It can greatly benefit us. But the third house can suggest a degree of mental, almost like volatility or mental heat and turbulence. So you want to be especially careful of that. You'd be very productive if you're learning something or studying something. You're really going to have the energy to go forward and get things done. And you might be, sharper, quicker, more incisive, and you might have a kind of flexibility and speed with you for the rest of the year. The retrograde does imply that you're going to be looking at some of the themes of anger, temper, communication, in communication with others or within your own mind. And that may be due to the kinds of challenges that are cropping up around you between now and the end of the year, which you have to find a way of working through constructively without getting overheated. So that's my take on that one, but I'd love to hear your stories about that as well as the year progresses. Finally, on the 30th, Jupiter conjoins with Pluto in your 12th house. Now, you've had your home planet in your 12th house for a while. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Sometimes it refers to longer periods of isolation, certainly can refer to periods of confinement, but also solitude and inward looking, an inward looking period. Jupiter and Pluto conjoining there are offering some kind of catharsis. And the catharsis may be deep, intense, not necessarily easy, but it will yield these very powerful results that finally lead to a pretty dramatic rebirth, maybe for Aquarians more than anyone else by the end of the year when Jupiter and Saturn will finally conjoin in your first house, which is a place of birth. The 12th is more like the labor pains. So while I think Aquarians have one of the most rocky transits recently, especially with Saturn in your home sign first house now, this is leading somewhere, and that all that 12th house action from the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter in its fall, etc. It will lead you to a pretty bright new beginning, I believe, by the end of the year. So hang in there. All right, let's go back. We'll wind it back, and we'll do it one more time for Gemini. So Gemini, if you're Gemini rising, you really have, I think, one of the more exciting years ahead. And the reason for that is obviously that, let's put Gemini on the ascendant here. The reason for that is that, this year you're getting a big Venus retrograde in your home sign in first house. And I think that that's a pretty exciting transit for the most part. Has a lot of promise behind it. But also you've got eclipses coming into your home sign. That means big, personal, deep, lasting changes. If you've been waiting for things to move or shift, if you felt stuck, this is your year. So at any rate, Venus is cazimi with the sun right around June 3rd. And that is a really auspicious moment for you. Remember, the Venus retrograde in a first house in general speaks to changes with identity, changes with health, changes with appearance, changes with style. And there's a reworking or a recreating yourself that's happening right now, which could affect so many different areas of life simultaneously. But identity, kind of a personal or existential makeover, that's the vibe of Venus retrograde in the first house if you're Gemini rising. And the cazimi on the 3rd represents this moment of greater empowerment, a moment of breakthrough where you start to get clear. And if you've been going through a process of feeling kind of getting broken down, even if you're breaking yourself down in some way, then this is the moment where the light bulb goes on upstairs and the recreation process begins. The reboot process starts. That's how I would describe it. Now, if we go forward into the 5th, just 2 days later, well, there's a lunar eclipse in your 7th house, which means this reboot, not surprisingly, could have something to do with love. It's Venus retrograde after all, and then the lunar eclipse comes through in your 7th house of love and relationships. Now that emphasis on love and relationships with a lunar eclipse often means culmination, endings, and completion, which means sometimes people are ready to exit our life. I've seen grandparents pass away or lovers, who we've been seeing for a while. It's their natural time to exit. But it can also mean that a relationship is reaching a new chapter as the current chapter that you're in comes to some kind of resolution or completion. And everyone knows what that's like when you're like, wow, we just finished some phase that we've been working on together. It feels like we've leveled up somehow. Lunar eclipses in your seventh can be like that. Can also mean that there's some social dynamic in your life that's shifting overall. Now, this is the first of many eclipses that you're going to get across your first and seventh house. So identity and relationships, really a key theme for you for the rest of the year and all the way into 2021 as well. Now, this is also being brought to you courtesy of a big square from Mars in your career house, and then Mars is going to conjoin Neptune in Pisces in your 10th house of career between the 12th and the 13th. So these changes are also pressing, they're hitting three angles at once. So they're also pressing in from the area of practice. The 10th house is called praxis, related to the idea of practice. What do I practice in the world? What am I doing in the world? What is my role? What skill or abilities do I have? What am I making of myself out in the world? And Mars Neptune may be introducing a new vision, or it may be uh, inspiring you, or it could be asking you to do something that's impossible and asking you to sacrifice too much of yourself. These are the kinds of questions and themes that you can watch for uh, that are also being highlighted from the career area of your chart, while these other changes are going on in the house of self and relationships. It's a pretty dynamic first half of the month for you, but these themes will play out for the rest of the year as well. Now, when we go forward from there, between the 18th and the 19th, it's pretty exciting because then we're going to get another series of eclipses right after Mercury starts to retrograde. Now, Mercury's retrograding in your second house of money and finances, and then right away on the 21st, a solar eclipse in your house of money and finances. A brand new chapter, and I would also call this a kind of culmination in relation to finances because it's a solar eclipse, which means a seed is being planted around money and resources. And Mercury is retrograde there, so there's some kind of revision or reworking of something, maybe some delays and setbacks, but ultimately the newness of the new moon and solar eclipse seems pretty positive. The reason I also call it a culmination is because you've had a lot of eclipses in your second house over the past few years, and so past year and a half. So there's something that's also, you've been working on things and you're ready for a really new relationship to money and finances. I think that's one way you could read it. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of Gemini risings, starting a new job or a new business, or paying off debts, or kind of a fresh start of some kind. At any rate, so you watch for that between the 18th and 21st as Mercury turns retrograde, and then you get a solar eclipse in your second house of finances. And that Mercury retrograde will be with us for about 3 weeks in your second house. Then between the 27th and the 30th, there's a couple of other dynamic transits happening at the very end of the month. So let's take a look at those. The first one is coming from Mars, who's switching between the 27th and 28th into Aries, moving into your 11th house. You're going to have Mars in your 11th house now for the rest of the year, with a big Mars retrograde period in between. This is focusing purely on the topic of, community, friends, organizations, groups, your comrades in life, so to speak. And it can be a time where there's a lot of advancement and movement and action and activity relative to friends and groups, cooperation or collaboration. You can also, frankly, deal with conflict and disturbances and strife relative to groups, friends, organizations, and so forth. So a bit of both. And you can expect that this theme will be a deep part of your inner work for the rest of the year, because Mars is going to be there for the rest of the year, and again does this big retrograde later in the summer. So we'll be visiting that later, but you might notice the theme of right when a planet ingresses, it often makes a splash. Here, Mars, God of War, entering the house of friends, groups, colleagues, benefactors. So sometimes that means action in collaboration with others. Sometimes that means strife or conflict, and you might notice a mix of the two as well. Now, on the 30th, the last big transit of the month, Jupiter will conjoin with Pluto, and that's taking place in your 8th house, which is a place that refers to, the money, finances, resources, and esteem of other people. Now, you've been going through a lot with regard to this place in your chart, with Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, all in that place this year. But and so usually there will be work relative to those topics. How much do I care what other people think about me? How much am I tied in to other people in complicated karmic contracts? And are they benefiting me? Am I losing something of myself in the process? So the study of karmic contracts, often financial, but sometimes emotional, and other ways in which we owe something to someone or someone owes something to us. These are pretty deep topics for you this year as a Gemini rising, and you're going to see another kind of cathartic wave of energy around these topics coming in at the very end of June. Sometimes the Jupiter Pluto in the 8th is also going to signify death and the transformation that is involved with the severing or cutting of cords with other people. So yeah, the one karmic contract that we all have is with death, right? We will all die someday. It's a debt that we all have as soon as we're born. That's how ancient astrologers looked at the 8th house in a sense. So sometimes the themes of death are there, but often not so literally. So I wouldn't worry about anything too literal in that case. But okay, so that's what the month looks like if you're a Gemini rising. So Earths are air signs. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'd love to hear your stories and hear how the month goes. Please feel free to share in the comment section. Remember that I do an overview video for the month of June as well, so you can check those out. I'll be breaking down all the transits as we go along throughout the month. And remember that all my new classes start the middle of the month. So if you haven't checked those out yet, you can head over to my website, nightlightastrology.com, and hopefully sign up for my new course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. I'd love to see some of you in class soon. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.